They didn't need trust to work together until someone made sure they lost it. Failure did not arrive as a collapse. It came as silence. The meeting room on the 36th floor was soundproofed, insulated from the city below and, apparently, from consequences. Tess sat straight-backed at the polished table, hands folded, listening to people she had outperformed for years explain why she was no longer essential. The language was clean, strategic, devoid of accusation. That, more than anything, made it unbearable. When it was over, there was nothing to argue against. No mistake she could point to, no injustice dramatic enough to fight. Just a decision already finalized. By the time she packed her office, the building felt unfamiliar. Her name was already gone from the internal directory. The rhythm she had lived by, deadlines, calls, pressure, dissolved in a single afternoon. 2 weeks later, Tess was driving toward the town she had left behind with the same efficiency she once used to leave it. The road narrowed. The cell signal weakened. Billboards disappeared, replaced by aging storefronts and familiar intersections she hadn't needed to remember until now. She told herself this was temporary, a tactical retreat. She would stabilize the situation, fix the problem, and move on. She always moved on. Her father's workshop sat exactly where it always had, just far enough from the town center to be ignored by anyone looking for progress. The building looked older than she remembered. Or maybe she was just better at noticing deterioration now. Cracks in the brick, faded signage, a structure holding together through habit rather than strength. Her father greeted her with relief that bordered on shame. They didn't talk about her job loss at first. Instead, they talked around it, about the weather, the town, small repairs he had been postponing. Tess let him. She knew avoidance when she saw it. The truth came out later that night, laid bare on the kitchen table in the form of overdue notices and quiet confessions. The business was failing. Not dramatically, slowly. Debt layered over debt. Payments missed not out of recklessness, but exhaustion. The workshop itself was the only thing keeping everything from collapsing completely. Tess didn't panic. Panic was useless. She asked questions. Numbers. Dates. Obligations. Her mind shifted gears automatically, slipping back into the familiar comfort of problem-solving. There was still leverage. The property had value. Space could be monetized. That was when her father mentioned the tenant. A restorer. Long-term. Reliable. Took up nearly half the usable workshop space. Paid modest rent, unchanged for years. He spoke about him like someone who mattered, which, to Tess, translated into risk. The next morning, Tess went to see the space for herself. The workshop was divided in a way that made no economic sense. One side cluttered with dormant equipment, the other maintained with near-clinical care. The air changed the moment she stepped into the restored section, quieter, controlled, intentional. A man stood over a workbench, absorbed in the careful restoration of an antique cabinet. He didn't acknowledge her immediately, as if she were a disruption not worth reacting to. Closed to visitors, he said without looking up. I'm not a visitor, Tess replied. I'm evaluating the property. That earned her his attention. Killian straightened, slowly, like someone choosing control over irritation. His expression was guarded, eyes sharp but not aggressive. A man used to protecting his space through calm rather than confrontation. This is a workspace, he said, not an evaluation site. Tess took in the details, the tools arranged with precision, the half-finished restoration that clearly demanded patience. She respected competence when she saw it. That didn't mean she would accommodate it. Then you'll understand efficiency, she said. And cost. She spoke in the language she trusted, square footage, market comparisons, potential restructuring. She didn't raise her voice or soften her tone. There was no need. The facts, as she saw them, were sufficient. Killian listened without interruption. That unsettled her more than anger would have. When she finished, he said, You're planning to change the terms. Reality has already changed them, Tess replied. I'm just acknowledging it. I have a lease. Leases exist within circumstances. His jaw tightened. You don't understand what this place is. I understand exactly what it is, she said, and what it's worth. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was measured, evaluative. You're here because something went wrong elsewhere, Killian said quietly. The observation struck closer than she expected. Tess didn't flinch, but something in her posture hardened. I'm here because this building matters to my family, she replied. Everything else is irrelevant. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acceptance of conflict. Then we're on opposite sides. For now, Tess said. She left without another word. As she stepped back outside, the weight of the place settled on her, not nostalgia, but responsibility. She didn't like how personal this already felt. She didn't like that the tenant wasn't careless or incompetent or easy to dismiss. Inside the workshop, Killian returned to his work, hands steady, mind anything but. The woman wasn't reckless. That made her dangerous. And somewhere between them, without either acknowledging it yet, the building itself became more than property. It became a fault line. Tess did not sleep well that night. Not because of jet lag or the unfamiliar quiet of her childhood room, but because her mind refused to disengage. Numbers kept resurfacing. Deadlines. Margins. The thin line between recovery and collapse. By morning, she had already built 3 contingency plans, none of which she liked. At breakfast, her father avoided her eyes. The bank called again, he said eventually, staring into his coffee. They're not waiting much longer. How long? Tess asked. 30 days. Maybe less. That narrowed everything. 30 days was not a problem to be solved. It was a countdown. She asked to see everything. Contracts. Loan agreements. Old correspondence. By noon, the kitchen table looked like a war room. Tess moved through the paperwork with controlled efficiency, but the conclusion was unavoidable. The workshop could not survive on sentiment. There is no version of this where nothing changes, she said finally. Her father nodded, defeated. Killian won't like it. Tess didn't answer. This wasn't about liking it. That afternoon, she returned to the workshop, this time with documents, not assumptions. Killian saw her before she spoke. He had learned to recognize the sound of intent in footsteps. He straightened, wiping his hands carefully, as if preparing for surgery rather than conversation. I'm not here to argue, Tess said. I'm here to talk about options. Options for whom? He asked. For all of us, she replied. Including you, if you're willing to listen. He didn't invite her further in, but he didn't stop her either. She laid out the situation plainly. No dramatics. No blame. Debt. Deadlines. The reality that the building would be sold if nothing changed. That his lease, however valid, would not survive a forced liquidation. This isn't a threat, she said. It's a timeline. Killian absorbed the information in silence. His expression didn't shift immediately, but something in his posture tightened. So your solution, he said slowly, is to squeeze the last value out of this place. My solution is to prevent it from being taken by someone who doesn't care what happens to it afterward. He laughed once, without humor. You're assuming I should trust you to care. She met his gaze. You shouldn't. You should trust incentives. That got his attention. She explained the proposal. A high-value antique collection had been identified through one of her father's old contacts. Pieces in poor condition, but significant market potential. Restoration would require time, precision, and credibility. Selling them would require logistics, exposure, and strategic positioning. You restore, Tess said. I handle everything else. Sales, transport, buyers. The revenue stabilizes the workshop long enough to clear the debt. And if it fails? Then the building goes anyway, she said. But at least we tried with control. Killian paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't like partnerships. He didn't like deadlines imposed by people who spoke in percentages instead of craft. You'd be using my work as leverage, he said. I'd be amplifying its value. Tess corrected. There's a difference. The silence stretched again, but this time it was calculation, not hostility. What do I get? He asked. You keep your space, Tess said. At least for now. And you get paid properly for work that's worth more than you've ever been allowed to charge. He stopped pacing. And the rent? He asked. Frozen, she said. Until the debt is cleared. It wasn't generosity. It was alignment. Killian studied her face, searching for cracks. Ambition disguised as concern, manipulation hidden under logic. What he found unsettled him more. Exhaustion, restraint, and a woman who had clearly lost something and refused to say what. This is temporary, he said. Yes, Tess agreed. Everything is. They drafted the agreement that evening. Informal but binding enough to matter. No promises beyond the immediate goal. No illusions about trust. The 30-day countdown became the pulse of the workshop. Tess didn't just move with purpose. She moved with a calendar that was bleeding out. She negotiated a razor-thin 10-day grace period with the bank, using the first signed restoration contracts as collateral. Every crate that arrived was a gamble against a clock that didn't care about the slow rhythm of Killian's craft. Killian watched at first, wary of intrusion, then gradually with reluctant respect. She didn't touch his tools. She didn't interrupt his process. She learned the rhythms of his work without trying to control them. And he noticed things too. How she stayed after hours, running projections under dim lights. How she flinched slightly whenever her phone buzzed with an unknown number. How she never spoke about the job she'd lost, as if naming it might give it power. They didn't talk about feelings. They talked about materials, timelines, damage that could be reversed and damage that couldn't. One evening, as they locked up, Killian said, "You're not bad at this." She almost smiled. "Neither are you," she replied. It wasn't intimacy. It wasn't trust. But it was no longer war. And somewhere beneath the numbers and wood shavings, something more fragile began to take shape. Unnoticed, unacknowledged, and entirely unprotected. The weeks settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned for. Not comfort, rhythm. Mornings began early in the workshop. Killian arrived first, always. He unlocked the door the same way every day, disarmed the alarm, checked humidity levels before touching a single tool. Tess noticed these things without commenting on them. Observation was her default state now. She arrived later, usually with coffee she didn't drink and calls she postponed. Her work unfolded in quieter ways. Emails drafted and redrafted, negotiations conducted in a controlled tone that left no room for misinterpretation. She built a network quickly, reaching out to collectors, auction houses, transport firms. She didn't sell promises. She sold structure. They spoke mostly about work. At first, that was all either of them could tolerate. Killian explained restoration the way one explained a boundary, clearly, without invitation for debate. Certain processes could not be rushed. Certain damage was irreversible. Tess listened, asked precise questions, never suggested shortcuts. That mattered to him more than praise would have. In return, she explained logistics. Risk exposure. Why certain buyers needed reassurance before commitment. Why visibility mattered even when quality spoke for itself. He didn't enjoy that part, but he didn't dismiss it either. Slowly, without agreement, they began to trust each other's domains. The antique collection revealed itself piece by piece. Cabinets with warped joints. Gilded frames dulled by neglect. A writing desk whose drawer refused to open without splintering the wood. Each object demanded patience. Each success felt earned rather than celebrated. Time passed differently inside the workshop. Outside, days slipped by unnoticed. Inside, progress was measured in millimeters and hours. Tess found herself adjusting her expectations without resentment. Deadlines shifted, not because of inefficiency, but because reality required it. She didn't apologize for the change. She adapted. Killian noticed. He also noticed how she never treated the workshop as temporary anymore. She stopped standing near the door. She stopped looking at her phone every 5 minutes. She learned where not to step, which surfaces were untouched for a reason. She asked before moving anything. One afternoon, she stayed late to help photograph a finished piece. The light was wrong at first. Too harsh. She adjusted angles until the surface revealed its depth instead of glare. "Hold it there," Killian said quietly. She did. For a moment, they worked without speaking, focused on the same goal. When it was done, neither commented on how naturally it had gone. They locked up together more often after that. Conversations remained practical, but edges softened. Tess learned that Killian had returned to this town deliberately, after opportunities elsewhere that he chose not to take. He learned that Tess hadn't planned to leave permanently. She had planned to outgrow the place entirely. Neither framed it as regret. Occasionally, something personal surfaced by accident. A remark about her father's health. A passing reference to a client who never paid but still haunted him. They didn't linger on these moments. They let them exist without examination. Trust grew not through confession, but consistency. One evening, as rain tapped against the workshop windows, Tess paused by a half-restored cabinet. "You don't rush this," she said. "Not a question." "No," Killian replied. "If I rush it, it fails later." She nodded slowly. "That used to be unacceptable to me." "What changed?" She considered lying. Instead, she said, reality. He didn't ask for more. The realization unsettled her later, alone in her childhood room. She had expected resistance here, from the town, from the work, from him. What she hadn't expected was how much she relied on the structure they had built together. How the days made sense again, even without a title attached to her name. Killian, meanwhile, found himself adjusting in ways he didn't name. He waited for her input before finalizing schedules. He explained decisions instead of simply making them. He noticed when she was quiet, not withdrawn, but calculating. One afternoon, she received a call that changed her posture instantly. She stepped outside to take it. Killian didn't hear the conversation, only the shift, shoulders squared, voice lowered into something sharper, more distant. When she returned, she went straight to her laptop without explanation. He didn't ask, but something had entered the space. Not conflict, not yet, just awareness. They finished another piece that week. A clean restoration. A successful sale. Enough progress to believe the plan might work. That night, as they locked the workshop, Tess hesitated. "This won't always be this stable," she said quietly. Killian looked at her, assessing the statement rather than reacting to it. "Nothing is," he replied. She nodded, accepting the answer. Neither of them said what they were both beginning to understand. That what they were building extended beyond wood and contracts, and that whatever came next would test whether it could survive pressure from outside the workshop walls. The call came on a Tuesday morning, ordinary enough to almost be missed. Tess was reviewing shipping insurance clauses when her phone vibrated on the workbench. Unknown number. She let it buzz once, twice, then answered, already irritated. "Still screening calls?" A voice asked lightly. "Familiar. Too familiar." Her spine straightened. "Beckett," she said. "Good to hear you remember me," he replied. "I was afraid success had erased all inconvenient names." She closed her laptop with deliberate calm and stepped outside the workshop. The air was cool, sharp with the smell of rain and oil. Killian glanced up but didn't follow her. She appreciated that more than she wanted to admit. "What do you want?" she asked. "Coffee," Beckett said. "Conversation. Possibly redemption. Pick one." She almost laughed. "Almost. You're not in this town by accident," Tess said. "So skip the performance." A pause, brief, controlled. He always adjusted quickly. "You're right," he said. "I'm here on business. And when I heard you were back, well, it felt irresponsible not to reach out." They met that afternoon at a cafe that had been renovated twice since Tess last lived here. Beckett fit into the space effortlessly. Tailored coat, relaxed confidence, the kind of man who made familiarity feel like an advantage. "You look different," he said, studying her. "Less armored." "You look the same," Tess replied. "Which tells me nothing has changed." He smiled. Still sharp. They spoke carefully at first. Neutral topics. The town. Mutual acquaintances. The illusion of coincidence. Beckett never asked directly about her job loss. He didn't need to. He let the absence speak for itself. "I'm working with a group expanding into regional properties," he said eventually. "Infrastructure. Redevelopment. Clean transitions." There it was. "And you thought of me because?" Tess asked. "Because you're wasted here," he said simply. "And because you know how to make difficult situations profitable without burning everything down." She held his gaze. "You don't do favors." "No," Beckett agreed. "I do alignment." He talked about opportunity, about returning to scale, about teams that understood her language. He didn't push. He planted. "You don't have to decide anything," he said as they stood to leave. "Just don't disappear again." Back at the workshop, Tess felt the shift immediately. The space felt smaller, more exposed. She returned to work with forced focus, but the conversation echoed, not because of temptation, but because of timing. Killian noticed her distraction by the end of the day. "You're off," he said. Not accusatory. Observant. "I ran into someone," she replied. "From my old life." That was all she offered. He nodded, filing the information away without comment. But something in his expression tightened. Not jealousy, not suspicion. Awareness. The next day, Beckett appeared at the workshop. Not inside. Outside. Leaning casually against his car like he belonged there. Killian saw him first. "Can I help you?" he asked. Beckett turned, smiled easily. "I'm looking for Tess." Killian didn't move aside immediately. "She's working." "So am I," Beckett said. "That's why I'm here." When Tess stepped out and saw him, irritation flickered, quickly masked. "You didn't say you were coming," she said. "I didn't want to interrupt," Beckett replied smoothly. eyes flicking to Killian with polite interest. You must be the craftsman. Restorer, Killian corrected. Of course, Beckett said. I admire people who build things with their hands. The compliment was too calculated to be sincere. They talked briefly. Superficial. Civil. Beckett asked about the workshop, about the building, about future plans, never pressing, never prying. He let curiosity do the work. As he left, he shook Killian's hand. You're lucky, he said. She's very good at what she does. The words lingered longer than the handshake. That evening, Beckett called Tess again. He doesn't trust me, Beckett said lightly. He doesn't trust anyone, Tess replied. Smart man, Beckett said. But dangerous. People like that see threats everywhere. She said nothing. You're building something fragile there, Beckett continued. I'd hate to see it collapse because someone couldn't see the bigger picture. And what picture is that? Tess asked. Beckett smiled into the silence. One where you don't limit yourself for a building that's already sinking. The seed was planted carefully. No lies. Just framing. Days passed. Then weeks. Beckett remained present but never intrusive. Occasional messages. Updates about projects nearby. Casual mentions of interest in the area around the workshop. He never said sale. He didn't have to. Killian noticed the change before Tess did. Buyers asking unusual questions. A transport firm suddenly withdrawing an offer. A collector hesitating without explanation. Small disruptions, plausible, deniable. You've got someone circling, Killian said one night. Tess looked up sharply. That's paranoid. Experience, he corrected. She wanted to argue. She didn't. Because part of her already knew. Beckett hadn't attacked. He didn't need to. He was doing what he did best. Reshaping perception until truth became optional. And the space between Tess and Killian, once defined by shared effort, began to fill with something quieter, more corrosive. Doubt. The first sign was not betrayal. It was inconsistency. A buyer who had confirmed interest went silent without explanation. A shipping company revised its quote upward at the last minute, citing external pressure. An auction house requested additional documentation Tess had already provided, twice. Each issue, taken alone, was manageable. Together, they formed a pattern. Tess noticed it immediately. Patterns were her instinctive language. She built a spreadsheet, flagged anomalies, traced timelines. Nothing overt connected them. No single point of failure. Just friction, deliberate, calculated friction. Killian noticed something else. He noticed how Tess began to double-check conversations they'd already had. How she stayed later than usual, tension visible in the set of her shoulders. How she answered calls with a voice that slipped, just slightly, back into the sharper register of her former life. What's happening? He asked one evening, as they stood over an unfinished cabinet. Nothing that matters, she replied too quickly. He didn't push, but he remembered the answer. 2 days later, Killian received an email. It came from an address he didn't recognize, forwarded through a generic account. No introduction, no signature, just an attachment and a single line of text. Thought you should know what she's planning. The document looked official. A preliminary agreement. Not signed, not finalized, but detailed enough to be convincing. It outlined a conditional sale of the workshop property, pending debt clearance. Tess's name appeared repeatedly. So did figures that made Killian's stomach tighten. He didn't believe it immediately, but Beckett had been thorough. The metadata on the attached agreement matched the exact timestamp of the hour Tess had stepped outside for that private call 2 days ago. The figures in the document weren't generic. They included the specific inventory numbers of the pieces Killian had only just finished. He didn't want to believe it, but the document contained details only someone with access to her private laptop could know. He told himself there had to be an explanation, some negotiation he wasn't aware of, some contingency plan she hadn't shared yet. The doubt didn't explode. It settled. That night, he watched Tess from across the workshop as she worked through calls, voice low, back turned. He noticed the way she minimized her screen when he approached. How she paused conversations when he entered the room. He told himself he was imagining it. Beckett called Tess the next morning. You're bleeding momentum, he said calmly. People are nervous. People are being manipulated, Tess replied. Same thing, Beckett said. Perception wins. She closed her eyes briefly. What do you want? I want to help you, he said. But you're trying to save something that doesn't want to be saved. That's not your call. No, Beckett agreed. But it is your responsibility. He didn't mention Killian. He didn't need to. He framed the workshop as a liability, the partnership as an emotional complication Tess couldn't afford. Don't let sentiment make decisions for you, he said. You didn't climb as far as you did by protecting other people's comfort. She ended the call without responding. That afternoon, Killian made a mistake. He asked a question too casually. If the building sells, he said, sanding carefully, how much notice would I get? Tess froze, just for a fraction of a second. Why would it sell? She asked. He shrugged, pretending indifference. Hypothetically. There is no hypothetical, she said. Not right now. Her answer was technically true. That made it worse. He nodded, returning to his work. But the silence between them sharpened. Questions went unasked. Explanations went unoffered. Each assumed the other was withholding something. Beckett escalated. A second message reached Killian, this time not a document, but a series of screenshots. Messages taken out of context. Phrases clipped and rearranged. Enough to suggest intent without proving it. Sale timelines look promising. Once the tenant situation is managed, none of it was fabricated outright. It was curated. Killian didn't confront Tess. That wasn't his nature. Instead, he withdrew. He worked later, spoke less, stopped explaining decisions. Tess felt the change immediately. You're pulling back, she said one night. I'm focusing, he replied. On what? On what I can control. The words landed harder than either of them expected. Trust, once eroded, didn't vanish dramatically. It thinned, became porous. Every silence invited interpretation. Every delay suggested motive. Tess, under pressure from all sides, began making contingency calls she hadn't wanted to make. Not commitments, never that, but preparations. She didn't tell Killian. Not because she meant to deceive him, but because she was no longer sure how much he needed to know. That uncertainty was enough. One evening, Killian arrived early and found her on the phone, voice controlled, tone unmistakably corporate. Yes, she said. If it comes to that, the property would be clean. She turned and saw him standing there. The line went dead between them. Neither spoke for several seconds. You're selling, he said finally. Not accusing. Concluding. I'm protecting the building, Tess replied. At my expense. No, she said. At everyone's survival. He shook his head slowly. You should have told me. I would have, she said, when there was something definite. That's not how trust works. The sentence hung between them, quiet, devastating. Killian walked away from the bench, from the cabinet, from the conversation. Tess stood alone in the workshop, surrounded by the very structure she was trying to save, realizing too late how narrow the line had become. Elsewhere in town, Beckett reviewed his messages and smiled faintly. He hadn't lied. He hadn't forced anything. He had simply ensured that when the truth arrived, it would come too late to feel clean. The silence that followed didn't heal. It hardened. Killian stopped asking questions altogether. He arrived earlier, left later, and reorganized his work so their schedules overlapped as little as possible. Conversations narrowed to necessity, measurements, delivery windows, materials. Nothing more. Beckett called that evening. You're running out of room, he said. I didn't ask for your analysis, Tess replied. You don't have to, Beckett said calmly. You're doing it yourself. The question is how much damage you're willing to absorb before you pivot. She closed her eyes, fingers pressed to her temple. You're enjoying this. I'm being realistic, he corrected. You're carrying everyone. Your father. The building. A tenant who doesn't understand leverage. Don't talk about him. That defensiveness is exactly the problem, Beckett said. You're compromising your own future to protect a situation that will never fully trust you. The words cut because they echoed her own fear. Beckett didn't push further. He didn't need to. He sent her a follow-up email an hour later. Clean, professional, outlining a role that would put her back where she belonged. Senior position. Authority. Distance. You can still walk away intact, the message implied. You don't have to lose everything to prove you tried. Meanwhile, Killian received confirmation of what he had already begun to believe. A supplier mentioned, casually, that there had been inquiries about the building. Another restorer in the region asked if Killian was planning to relocate. None of it came directly from Tess. That absence spoke louder than any admission. He stopped sharing his process entirely. When Tess asked why a restoration timeline had shifted, he answered flatly, because I decided it should. This affects the sale window, she said. That's not my concern, he replied. The line between them finally snapped. You don't get to shut me out, Tess said, voice controlled but tight. We're in this together. We were, Killian corrected. Until you started making decisions without me. I didn't make decisions, she said. I prepared for outcomes. She noticed the change in him almost immediately. A shorter glance, a pause before answering questions, a subtle tightening of his shoulders. He no longer explained decisions. He no longer asked for her input on scheduling. His walls had gone up, silent and immovable. Tess tried to counteract it. She laid out her plans in painstaking detail, forwarded schedules, confirmed shipments, even prepared a preliminary sales pitch for a potential buyer. She wanted transparency. She wanted to restore trust. Every gesture was met with polite acknowledgement, not engagement. The tension grew daily. Every interaction was measured, every word weighed. They avoided eye contact while moving through the workshop. Conversations were stripped to necessity. Materials, timelines, client communications. Everything personal or subjective was cut away. Then Beckett appeared again, not in person, but through another carefully timed intervention. A trusted supplier called Killian directly, claiming Tess had discussed potential terms for a sale without consulting him. The phrasing was neutral, factual, verifiable. Yet in the context of the photographs and previous disruptions, it hit with the weight of accusation. Killian confronted Tess later that evening. You met with someone, he said, voice low, steady. I spoke with a collector, Tess replied. You were aware. Not like that, he said. You never told me it would lead to negotiations. I don't negotiate without you, Tess said. I prepare. That's different. That's semantics, he replied. It's the same outcome. You're keeping me out. I'm trying to keep us in, she shot back. This isn't about me or you. It's about saving the building. Killian's hands clenched briefly around the edge of the workbench. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that followed carried everything unspoken: mistrust, frustration, fear. They left the workshop that night without another word. Tess retreated to her childhood room, staring at the ceiling, calculating, replaying the day's events. The meticulous strategy she had crafted now seemed insufficient. Beckett's presence was no longer subtle. It had begun to infiltrate their partnership, fracturing the foundation they had built together. Killian stayed in the workshop, pacing slowly, checking the photographs again, verifying details against his memory. He could not yet accuse her of wrongdoing, but the pattern was unmistakable. Trust, once hard-won through months of collaboration, had begun to erode under pressure neither could control. By the next morning, they were strangers sharing the same space. Tess carried the weight of looming deadlines. Killian carried the weight of unconfirmed betrayal. And Beckett, far away, monitored each small shift, each hesitation, each faltering glance, knowing that the crisis he had engineered was approaching its peak. The fracture lines were visible now, deep, subtle, dangerous, and neither of them could stop it. Killian didn't believe the emails immediately, but Beckett had been thorough. The metadata on the attached agreement matched the exact timestamp of the hour Tess had stepped outside for that private call. The figures weren't generic. They included specific inventory numbers of pieces Killian had only just finished. He didn't want to believe it, but the document contained details only someone with access to her private laptop could know. Suspicion had become a calculated certainty. Tess noticed the change immediately. Did you speak to the collector? Killian asked at last, not looking up from the cabinet he was restoring. I did, Tess replied evenly. I told you everything I could. You were aware of the arrangements. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Silence carried accusation with heavier weight than words ever could. They worked in parallel, sharing space, but no longer process. Tess planned meticulously, checking every shipment, confirming every buyer. Killian measured wood grain, adjusted joints, repeated processes without discussion. The partnership, once seamless, had become two soloists in a shared hall. Careful not to touch, careful not to speak, careful not to trust. By midday, the tension had crystallized. You've changed your schedule, Killian said quietly, almost a murmur. I adapted, Tess replied, to external factors. And you didn't tell me, he said. His voice was low, but sharp. I didn't know it mattered, she said. Her jaw clenched. We're both doing what we can. Killian slammed a tool down, the sound echoing through the workshop. Not a tantrum, a punctuation, a boundary. I don't know what we are anymore, he said. Not partners. Not collaborators. Not anything I recognize. Tess's chest tightened. She had anticipated frustration, misunderstanding, but not this. Not the sense that everything they had built might collapse under the weight of suspicion alone. I'm not trying to hide anything, she said, stepping closer, keeping her voice even. Everything I do is to save the workshop. That's not enough, he said. You think your plans protect me. They don't. They protect you. Maybe even Beckett. I don't know anymore. Her stomach sank. She had feared this moment. Not because of what she had done, but because she knew the truth would never land cleanly once manipulated from outside. She considered explaining, defending, arguing, but the words felt hollow. Evidence had been curated, perception had been shifted, and trust, once broken, could not be patched with explanations. The space between them thickened. Every movement, every glance, every unsaid word widened the gap. Killian stepped back, away from the workbench, away from her. He didn't storm out. He didn't yell. He simply folded inward, retreating into precision, into wood, into method. A fortress of hands and tools, walls rising around him. Tess watched him. For a moment, she felt helpless. Not because she lacked options, but because every option had consequences. Career, reputation, family, building, all in conflict with one fragile, human need: trust. By evening, Tess was alone. The workshop smelled of varnish, sawdust, and tension. Nothing had been broken physically. Everything had been broken emotionally. She sat at the desk, spreadsheets and plans spread around her like a battlefield map. Every number was right. Every calculation exact. Yet the victory she had imagined was hollow. Her phone buzzed. A message from Beckett. Timing is everything. You know what must be done. She stared at it, fingers hovering. Not coercion. Not demand. Just insinuation. Suggestion. Possibility. And suddenly, the simple choice between career and truth became a knife at her ribs. The sun dipped below the horizon. The workshop lights hummed overhead. Tess leaned back, eyes closed, and let the weight of the moment press down. One wrong move, one misstep, one decision influenced by fear, and everything could collapse. Not just the building, not just the debt, not just her family's fragile stability, but the bond she had just begun to rebuild with Killian. And she understood, with stark clarity, that saving the workshop now demanded more than skill or strategy. It demanded courage. It demanded transparency. It demanded confrontation, with Beckett, with Killian, and with herself. Tess sat in the dark of her childhood room, the silence of the town pressing against the windows. She didn't look for relief anymore. She looked for a way to break the circuit Beckett had built. By dawn, the hum of the workshop was the only sound left that made sense. She arrived before Killian, waiting for the one thing numbers couldn't fix: a direct conversation. Tess stood at the entrance, phone in hand. The message from Beckett still lingered in her mind. She hadn't responded. She had considered walking away, considering the offer to return to the corporate world, to resume a life of authority and control, far from the frustrations, manipulations, and fragile human bonds of the workshop. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not when so much was still at stake. She walked to the workbench, where Killian was already present, polishing the surface of a recently restored cabinet. He didn't look up. She paused, breathed, tried to read him. "I'm done letting other people decide for us," she said finally. Her voice low but firm. He looked up slowly, neutral, cautious, wary. "Explain." She placed her phone on the bench, unlocked it, and opened her messages. Screenshots, emails, and forwarded notes. Everything Beckett had used to manipulate perception. She laid them out in a line, meticulous, precise. Every disruption, every hesitation, every doubt. "It's all been orchestrated," Tess said. "He planted evidence, manipulated suppliers, curated perception to make us doubt each other." Killian's eyes scanned the messages, the documents, the dates. His hands clenched briefly, then relaxed. Not relief, not satisfaction. Recognition. The clarity that comes only when deception is undeniable. "So all of it," he murmured, "wasn't real. Not the work. Not us. Just the distractions. And he counted on us faltering under pressure." Tess met his gaze directly. "I should have told you earlier. I didn't because I wasn't sure how to stop it without proof." He didn't speak for a moment. The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. Finally, he said, "We rebuild differently now. Transparency. Every decision. Every step. No more shadows. Yes, Tess replied, relief and determination mingling. Together, they worked in tandem that day like they had months ago, but differently, with intentional communication, checks, and shared oversight. Every crate, every restoration note, every potential buyer interaction was documented, shared, and discussed. They were no longer just collaborators. They were partners in every sense the word could hold. Tess met Beckett in the same cafe where he first tried to lure her back. She didn't lead with anger. She led with a folder. And it were not just his messages to Killian, but the trail of his interference with the shipping firm. Interference that, if leaked, would ruin his firm's reputation for clean transitions. You're not here for the land anymore, Beckett. You're here for damage control, she said, sliding the folder across the table. Call off the buyers you scared away. Now, or I don't just save the workshop. I make sure every developer in the state knows you're a liability. Beckett looked at the documents, his smile finally faltering. He wasn't defeated by morality. He was defeated by a superior risk assessment. He picked up his phone. You always were too expensive to keep, he muttered, making the first call. The leverage hadn't evaporated. Tess had simply turned it against him. Tess didn't need him to apologize. She only needed the control back, over her decisions, her space, her life. Returning to the workshop, she found Killian measuring a newly finished frame. The tension was gone, replaced with cautious ease. Not naive trust, hard-earned trust. The kind built through work, acknowledgement, and shared resilience. Killian handed her a set of keys he'd cut for the new internal locks. One for you, one for me, he said. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a promise. It was an admission that the walls were down. Tess took them, the metal cold and solid in her palm, and for the first time, the silence in the workshop felt earned.